Get the slides, please. Thank you, Jonathan. I'd like to thank the ICT and Dr. Boisganor for this kind invitation. It's a privilege to speak to you today. I'm going to summarize just the key points from the book in 20 minutes. I'm going to have one conceptual slide at the start, and then I want to get into the practice of how that applies on the ground. My basic proposition is that the concept of war contains violence in the world, in the sense that it establishes a clear boundary between war and peace, military activity and political activity. And my main contention is that while that paradigm still exists, that's not the dominant tendency. The dominant tendency today is towards what I call armed politics, which is where you do not have clear boundaries between war and peace, do not have clear boundaries between military and political activity, and you have more open-ended conflicts, therefore, because you do not have a clear boundary. And I want to just spend one slide on that concept, and then I'll move into more kind of practical stuff. This is my conceptual slide. In the top left-hand corner, we have a picture of a Louis XIV cannon with the inscription Ultima Ratio Regum, the final argument of kings. I put this there because, to my mind, it symbolizes what war is in its traditional form. That is, brutal, decisive, and finite. We assume that it's a polarized contest, one side against the other, the aim being to militarily defeat the enemy to set conditions for a political solution. So it's a sequential concept. There's the military phase and the political phase. There is a clear boundary between war and peace. And this lends itself to more decisive end states. Of course, the key presumption is that there is a clear enemy, a clear polarity between two sides, and an enemy that lends itself to be defeated militarily. And what I'm saying is that the dominant tendency today, exemplified more by this slide of the situation in Syria, meant to exemplify the fragmented nature in which, rather than two sides in a polarized one side against the other traditional paradigm, rather you have a fragmented and kaleidoscopic dynamic in which actors in a conflict are maneuvering vis-a-vis one another for power and influence as much as in a polarized way. And in that paradigm, it's very hard to apply the traditional principles of war. I think rather we have these tendencies when we have fragmented battlefields. Tactical action becomes highly politicized because you have to think about the effect not just against the actor against whom you're taking military action, but against how that's going to play out with the other actors. So the perceived quality of an action becomes key. We also have, because of the information revolution, I think the dominant contextual change in contemporary conflict at the macro level is the information revolution, by which I mean the speed and interconnectivity of contemporary globalization. That means that a conflict might start as polarized. We saw that in Libya, we saw that in Syria, where a rebel group, which is relatively coherent, raises up against the government. Very quickly, all kinds of actors, audiences, either the local level, regional, international, can come in, can bolt onto that conflict, and they bring their own prejudices, interests, and aspirations into that conflict. So that network effect, it might unite people, but it very quickly divides them, and it creates fragmentation. We've seen that in Libya, we see that in Libya today, and we see it in Syria. So I think fragmentation is a dominant tendency in contemporary armed conflict. Now, I'm not saying, by dominant tendency, I don't mean the only tendency. I want to be clear. There are still polarized conflicts. This is just the dominant tendency. And when we are in these conflicts that are more highly politicized, the use of what I call coercive communication becomes more important. This is the informational dimension of conflict. So it's not really just about using armed force. The economic element, the informational element, becomes important. We're seeing that in the Ukraine today, for example. A lot of the Russian campaign is not military, so that's only a small part of it. A lot of actions, for example, big Russian exercises on the Ukraine border, are intended to send a coercive communication to Kiev, which effectively is, don't intervene in East Ukraine, or something to that effect. So the point is that I talked at the start about the clear boundary between military and political activity corresponding to a clear boundary between war and peace. But plainly, when you start mixing in military activity into routine political activity, i.e. communication, economics, you start to erode the boundary between war and peace, and you get more open-ended conflicts. And we start talking often about stability versus victory. I think victory is a concept that belongs most clearly with this concept. In this concept, we tend to talk more about stability. Now I want to move on to the practical slides. Okay, the book's rooted in my experience in Afghanistan, so that gives you some idea of the kind of limitations of my argument, if you like, but I think that Afghanistan is not an anomaly because it is a fragmented battlefield and points to the contemporary conflict more broadly. This is a slide from my first tour. It's a real slide, it's not one I made up. It's an operation my battle group went in to clear a Taliban base area in South Afghanistan. This corresponds to the visual way in which we might understand the traditional paradigm of war, because we say there is an enemy. This is the valley, this is the enemy, the red, this is a real operation that happened. And this is the way we visualize the traditional paradigm. And we say if we kill or capture that enemy, hit them, we win, we generically win. We haven't really defined what winning means, but we generically win. So we went in, and that's what happened. We hit the enemy positions and killed or captured them and cleared the valley. What's the problem with that? The problem with that is that that would have been effective if we were fighting a clearly polarized enemy. But we weren't. We were not fighting a clearly coherent enemy force. We were fighting something much more akin to this. So let me explain this. This is what I call the narrative. This is people who support the government of Afghanistan, which was the mission we were trying to achieve, against and undecided. And our mission is basically, it's unrealistic to get people to actively support them in a kind of positive sense, but our mission is trying to get basically a diverse set of constituencies, some very hostile, some not, some armed, some not, to subscribe to the rule of the Afghan government to the extent that they don't aren't actively going to oppose it in a sort of hostile manner. So, yes, there were genuine hardcore Taliban. Sorry, this is the crosshair. So this axis, people who support the Afghan government narrative, don't support. This, people who support the Taliban narrative, support, don't support. So clearly the hardcore insurgents don't support the Afghan government narrative and they support their own narrative. This is your hardcore Taliban. Yes, that exists. There is a basic polarity. I'm not saying that conflict has completely lost its polarized element. And obviously for the soldier on the ground, it's always polarized, but that's a different thing. That's about combat, not strategy. So we're talking here that there is a polarized element, and there are people who really support the government. But more broadly than that, there are a lot of audiences who are not strongly affiliated with either side. They are out there for their own interests. There are drug factions. We sacked the governor of Helmand because he's involved in narcotics. He flipped his militia, who had been the government guys because he was the governor, across the Taliban. Did he change sides? No, he stayed on his own side. He stayed in Kabul throughout the conflict. He still mates with Karzai, and he's probably going to be governor again. His brother-in-law remained the district governor of one of the districts in Helmand throughout the whole time. So, I say that's fragmented and kaleidoscopic, with each side trying to safeguard its own interests. The key point being that when the British troops went into northern Helmand and fought this governor's militia, we called them Taliban. We said, they are the Taliban. We treated everyone who shot at us as the enemy and attributed to that enemy a single corporate identity, i.e. the Taliban. And we thought that by killing or capturing these people, we would win. And the result was a massively expanding insurgency, because we aggregated to this concept a whole load of audiences that weren't necessarily the enemy, because they were had different interests. So they became red. Here we have just normal villagers who, we recruited one tribe into the police. They were hassling other tribes based on traditional tribal grievances, and very quickly the other tribe would become Taliban. But were they really fighting for the Taliban or their own interests? The key point is that in the early days, by having a quite static concept of the enemy based on a traditional paradigm of war, the British Army made the problem worse by basically making all these guys red. We inflated the size of the enemy, and we didn't have enough troops to defeat them in a conventional sense. I want to now talk about how that concept evolved. I can't use the actual slides from Afghanistan because they're classified, but I worked a lot on improving our targeting, and I've basically fictionalized a real example. So I've relocated it in Somalia, but this is fictional, but it represents the the real dynamics of how we responded to the conflict in Afghanistan between about, by we I mean the British Army and the coalition forces in general, between about 2009 and the current, well, in 2013. This is an example of how you would deal with a problem in a traditional sense. You have an enemy. You are calling this an enemy. You strike the enemy, and you think that means you win. In the traditional paradigm of war, you do. But what happens if actually what you've got is, yeah, you do have some hardcore jihadists, but you've got a couple of tribes. You've got the government forces who, in this mission, fictionally, we're trying to support, like we're trying to support them in Afghanistan, and a pirate faction. Well, we're replaying this operation now. We are having political effects on the ground. We're communicating with these groups, whether we like it or not. We're having a political effect. And what we've done is we've actually, because we went in there without thinking about the political consequences, second-order effects of a military action, we've basically got the pirates to join with the jihadists. And we've got elements of Tribe B who are also supporting. The point is, if you go into an operation and you apply rigidly and literally the traditional paradigm of war, you are pushing political buttons in the dark because you do not know, you haven't even tried to understand what the second-order political effects are going to be. So you just don't know. You might be lucky, you might not. You just don't know. We didn't know in Helmand in 2006, and we made the insurgency a lot bigger. Now, what's the solution to that then? What I say is, understand the political context in its own terms. You need to not just have military reconnaissance to find out where the enemy is. You need to invest heavily in having political reconnaissance that understands the linkages between the different, between who holds power and how they relate to each other. And that means greater integration of civil and military effect. And we moved to that. If you saw the change in the way in which our headquarters were configured, became a lot more kind of, you know, we talk about red picture, enemy, white picture, civilian. We had a red-white picture, one picture. And rather than saying the enemy of this big block, we broke them up and said, actually, look, this logistics guy is basically kind of corrupt government. These are really kind of pirates in this example. These are the hardcore jihadists. These are more tribal fighters and so on. And these are kind of just, sorry, I should have pressed that button. So I'm saying, rather than look at it like that, we're saying, look at them in their own terms. Who are they really? Are they just pirates, or are they real hardcore insurgents? And once we know that, we can have a more sophisticated approach because the enemy is more defined, it's a more clearly defined target, which lends itself more clearly to be defeated. So we have a common political operating picture. Those arrows are all the linkages to show how power relates between them, so you might understand how what the political effect is going to be if we strike there. So I'm moving from a geographical map I showed you at the start to a political map, and this is the way targeting evolved in Helmand. And rather than the big groups, we break them down. We're breaking down the big constituencies into smaller ones. A bit like a political consultant might do in an election. We're trying to find out what are the basis of political identity in that area so that we can break off the moderate factions from the hardcore and target military force more precisely in that area and achieve political stability that equals, in this case, Somalia, but in Afghanistan, people not actively fighting the Afghan government. So we say, right, we need to control this terrain. This is political terrain. This is not physical terrain. Obviously, that will translate into physical terrain because those people live somewhere physically. But that's not your start point. Your start point is to control political space. Now, we say, what's our narrative? Well, the narrative basically is what's your strategy, right? How do I explain my actions? What's the organizing idea that gives meaning to my actions to connect them to the goal of policy? That strategy. And we're saying, well, here in Somalia, we've got this sort of generic Western narrative, support the government, anti-piracy, rule of law and security. And this is how they line up. You know, polling might not be literal, it's kind of more methods analogous to polling. Basically, like I showed you in that graphic at the start, to what extent do people, do these constituencies, how do they line up against that narrative as a whole? A bit like in an election, people might support a politician, but if he changes one element of his message on a given area of policy, they might change. So we test our narrative. You know, we're saying here that in this fictional example, most people haven't really got a problem with the government. They go green. The pirates haven't really got a problem with the government. But they do have a problem with anti-piracy, and a lot of the tribes probably get money from anti-piracy. You know, in Afghanistan, this was drugs. We took a bigger anti-drugs policy, and we expanded the insurgency. I'm not saying that was wrong, that was right. Maybe the government's got a good reason for doing the anti-drugs thing, but you can't deny that expanded the scope of the insurgency. We made a choice to have a given strategy that expanded the size of the enemy. Well, that's fine, but we need to be very, very clear in future operations what exactly the narrative is. And in Afghanistan, you saw that the more ideological goals got tailored down a lot by about 2009, and the goal was really just stability. All the ideological stuff just went out the window. And that was because people, if you tell an Afghan peasant, we're going to burn your drugs, they'll fight you. It's that simple. So, what we're saying is, if you take out the anti-piracy, you can get fewer people to fight you, and you isolate your enemy. Like I said, this doesn't mean that you have to do this. It's a choice. It's a political choice. You can do the pirate. If you're a strategist, you can go to a politician, and you can say, hey, if we do all four, this will be the size of the enemy. If you take out the anti-piracy, this will be the size of the enemy. Your choice. We'll do what you tell us to do. But let's at least have the discussion. Because in the traditional concept of war, you don't do that. You just say, let's defeat the enemy, and that equals this kind of comprehensive concept of defeat. In armed politics, you're saying, what are we trying to achieve? Let's be precise here. That's basically the difference. And so here, here I'm saying that fictionally we've decided to take out the anti-piracy. Okay, 3.5 minutes left. I'm going to move on then. So what I'm saying is that once you've done that, you can start executing your operation on a common. You don't just have a common picture; you have common operations. You are using civilian assets and military assets in the same space on the same picture, and it's more effective. So, you know, you can use this is kind of Afghan counterinsurgency based, but you can change it. This is more of a civilian thing. We're going to try to get the pirates away using more kind of economic means or sanctions, legal means against those guys in the top right. And we're going to use kinetic force against the kind of proper enemy. The point is, I'm not saying armed politics is the perfect solution at all. It has a lot of problems, a lot of limitations. It's very hard to get that kind of political information in the first place, especially if you're a Western force going into a new area. I'm not pretending that it's not. 2, like I said, war has its advantages. It's decisive and clear. But you're pushing political buttons in the dark, unless you have a clear enemy to defeat in the first place, it's not even available as an option. Armed politics, the measurement is just the extent to which you can reconfigure the power relationships in society to equal your policy aim. So if our policy aim in Somalia and Afghanistan is stability, you're trying to reconfigure the politics so that people don't fight the Afghan government. And the problem is, politics doesn't end, so that evolves. So I'm not claiming that armed politics is a silver bullet. You know, it's different. It's a different way of using force in conjunction with civilian means than the traditional paradigm of war. But it is a lot more effective in fragmented battlefields. But you do move from the language of victory to the language of success, to the language of stability. It's a different concept. The point is that sometimes war makes sense, sometimes armed politics makes sense. These don't exist in the abstract. You have to apply them to specific facts on the ground to decide what option works best. This is a real slide. I've kind of reduced it and cut out some stuff for the security reasons. It just shows, okay, this is my combined force, Norris, Raj South, human terrain map, and so on. This is a real example from Afghanistan with the names rubbed out, showing how we judge success in an area over a given month. So you move from, this is what I mean by controlling political space, right? Now, this is an example of a kind of how we assessed our effect over the whole operation, over the kind of whole deployment of the battalion or the brigade. Don't be confused by all these boxes. It's the same chart I showed you before. Just a lot of all these boxes are audiences who have a given political affiliation. So we're going to start off with a kind of kinetic operation. But you know, all the operations we're doing over a year-long period. You know, we might destroy this group, you might reintegrate that group, you might do a whole lot of civilian stuff. You're trying to get the center ground, your key nodes, across to your narrative, which is called stability. But there's still going to be narco-militia, residual insurgents. They're still there. I'm not claiming that armed politics equals decisive action. It's just stability. It's a bit like the police managing crime, say in London, you don't talk about defeating crime, you manage it. It's a long-term problem. So it's a different way of thinking about a problem. So this is my final slide, okay. Contemporary armed conflict. I think you do still have occasionally traditional one side against the other conflicts. Look at, say, the Sri Lankan Civil War. But the trend is towards armed politics because increasingly we're finding that battlefields are fragmented and don't lend themselves to even applying the traditional paradigm in the first place, unless you're prepared to commit to the kind of methods that the Sri Lankans use. So that's an open question. So I think the second point, the traditional boundary between war and peace means that increasingly you have to remember that armed politics blurs the boundary between war and peace, and it does create open-ended conflicts. So if you want to use those methods, don't expect decisive end states either. Again, you might not want to. The last three go together: shape, influence, consolidate. What I'm saying is that I think this is the way in which military operations are going to go towards this kind of language. I've been in the US working with their doctrine guys a bit, and I'm not speaking for them in any way, but I think this is kind of the way it's going to go. Shape, we're talking about shaping the politics in advance of an operation. Influence, which comprehends both kinetic, violent means and non-violent means in the same space. You're trying to influence an area. You're trying to communicate coercively with a given set of constituencies, only some of which will be the enemy. Others will be groups which have power, and you need their support to create stability, but are not strictly the enemy. And thirdly, consolidate. This applies where Western forces are working with, say, other governments, like the Afghan government. Who actually owns the jurisdiction? Whose narrative is it? If the Afghan, I was playing around with the narrative earlier. Well, whose narrative is that? Because it's all very well saying we're going to do this and this, but actually legally the Afghan government is in charge. So if you've got a corrupt policeman, and you can go in and say, "Oh, why haven't you sacked him?" Well, we can't sack him because actually we haven't got the legal authority to do that. So how far do we actually want to engage with the local forces if we can't own their narrative? Okay, there we go. 20 minutes.